And welcome to another episode of G220 Radio. This is episode number 394. And today's topic is going to be on open air preaching and evangelism. Mike, how are we doing this week, brother?
Doing pretty good. Sorry, kind of getting over a small cold.
Well, I've definitely appreciated you, holding it down the last couple of weeks, keeping Nathaniel in order while George and I have been out doing other things. Yes, absolutely. And Nathaniel, how you doing, brother?
I'm doing excellent. Yesterday was the first day of school at Akron, and thanks be to God we got to be there to share the gospel. With a lot of kids. I had some good conversations and stuff, and it was just a good day. We had lots of people joining us and everything. And I did find out how to register so they know when we're coming, and got a bunch of days picked out so I can be up there more often.
Yeah, that's great. It's interesting because you're in your 30s and you said a bunch of kids. And isn't it interesting as you get a little bit older, they become kids to you? So.
Yeah, like there's these freshmen that I talked to that were just like, look like these little girls.
Yeah. And as you can see, we have another individual with us. He is our guest for tonight, Ryan Denton. He is going to be talking to us about open air preaching tonight and evangelism. He also wrote a book called A Certain Sound. And so we're going to talk to him about that as well. So Ryan, welcome to G220 Radio, brother.
Yeah, thank you for having me on. Blessed to be here.
All right, so we're going to go ahead and jump right into this here on G220 Radio. Episode number 394. We do got some stuff planned, or we're planning for episode number 400 whenever we get to that in the next couple of weeks. Maybe that, I was thinking, maybe that could be a free-for-all, and, since me and Mike was having a little disagreement over there on the Nephilim, we can have a show where we all just bring things where we actually disagree, because I don't know if many of the listeners know where we disagree on certain things because we never really make issues over it. So that might be a topic or an idea for the topic of when we reach number 400.
Yeah, convert everyone to my side.
But as we said, we got Ryan Denton with us tonight. So Ryan, brother, why don't you go ahead, and for those who are tuning in and are not familiar with you, I'm sure many of the listeners on G220 Radio probably are, but if they're not, why don't you go ahead and share your testimony, how you came to know the Lord, how long you've been a believer in Christ, how long you've been evangelizing, and how your ministry came about.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so right now I live in El Paso, Texas. I'm 34 years old, and the Lord saved me when I was 22, and I was born and raised in New Mexico, and really maybe a nominal Christian home. And then I got out of high school and kind of went the nominal Christian route where it no longer was serious, because it never was serious as far as my faith goes. And so just started doing the lifestyle of partying and just reckless living and debauchery and trying to have a good time. And then it started, the Lord used various things, but really it just started kind of dawning on me that this is a really miserable way to do things. And even though from the outside looking in, I had a good job, had a good time, had a lot of friends, and something was just off. There were a few events that really took place, but the Lord really kind of struck me with an arrow whenever a friend of mine died, and it started. It impacted me in a very personal way. And I had friends die before this friend, but this for whatever reason, the Lord just used this to really kind of enlighten me as far as mortality and just really stir me and awaken me to begin to look into the things of God more seriously. And so by his grace, I picked up a Bible and started reading it. And I was actually living with a woman at that time. And when the Lord starts stirring within, it's just like, man, I've got to stop doing this. I moved in with my brother. There was still some parties and things like that going on, but in the meantime, I'm reading the scriptures and I'm praying. for me, there was never that instantaneous moment where I just knew I was converted, but it was a very brief process as far as the season itself goes. And so, I mean, I just remember reading the Bible all the time, praying all the time, taking walks, and just being mesmerized by God, and somewhere along the way, the partying and the lifestyle of sin and debauchery really became just distasteful. I no longer wanted it. I was miserable by it, even indulging just a little bit. I eventually, by God's grace, just started to flee from that. And so again, I mean, I do know I was around 22, so that's about 12 years ago. And then from there, it was pretty quick when I kind of started realizing I felt like I needed to preach. I needed to minister in some way. But again, without, having been born in a nominal church and really having no church home, I never really had much discipling going on until like 5 or 6 years later. I ended up going to college after I was saved. I went to move to another city in Albuquerque. And then from there, I mean, I was just bouncing around church to church, trying to find Christians, but at the same time, that's a pretty dark place. So struggling with that, but at the same time, the Lord always kept me. So on the one hand, I wanted to preach, I wanted to minister. I also wanted to teach. I mean, I didn't know exactly how the Lord was going to use me. And so it was just kind of seeking his face. And then, one thing about when I did move to Albuquerque though, so the first day I went to college at UNM, and I'm on campus. It's the first day of the semester, and I saw a guy open air preaching for the first time in my life. And he wasn't a shock and awe guy. He wasn't a Pelagian. I mean, as far as I know, I mean, he had a Bible and he was preaching, nothing else. And he had a crowd there and they were heckling him and mocking him. But when I saw that, there was something that just like clinched down in me. And I just knew I had to do that at one point. And it would be, like 5 or 6 years until I actually did it. But when I saw that guy, I thought, man, I've got to jump in there. And thankfully I didn't, because I wasn't ready at that time. But eventually, by God's grace, I mean, it's just something the Lord stirs you to do. And you guys that do it, you know how it is. I mean, it's just, it's a calling, and it's a burden that we have. And then from there, I did get into a church, and I was discipled, and met some ministers, and they spent a lot of time with me. Was eventually ordained. I ended up going to seminary, was a pastor for about 2 years on the Navajo reservation. And then when I was pastoring, that's when I realized, I was very naive. I wasn't really aware of the difference between pastoring and something more like evangelism. Mm-hmm. And so I thought, in order to preach, you have to pastor, because how else will you preach? And so I knew I wanted to preach, and I felt burdened to preach. But I thought the only way you could do it was pastoring. So while I'm pastoring, most of my time is spent evangelizing. I'm preaching in jails. I'm preaching in prisons. I'm doing open air preaching pretty regularly by then. And then along the way, I'm starting to realize there's a distinction between pastoring and evangelism. And so, had a talk with the deacons, and shared with them kind of what I felt like the Lord was leading us to do. And that was the ministry that that I'm overseeing now with Christ in the Wild Ministries. And it's just, so that's 2016 when I started that. And it's just an evangelism ministry. I mean, it's hard because I don't want to, we don't want to be a parachurch ministry. That's the danger, and right. So, I mean, even now here in El Paso, I'm actually an elder now. And so there's I have a high view of the church. I really consider it very important and special for a lot of ways. Just if nothing else, for the sake of helping people. I mean, there's a retinue of good things about the church, but one of those being looking into my own life and seeing just the need that I had for somebody to take me under their wings and just help me along. And of course, it took a while for me, and so, but yeah, so that's kind of what we do here. I mean, the goal is to bring the gospel to the lost, get the gospel outside the church for the sake of the church. We want to bring them back in and disciple them and do whatever we can. And so whether it's open air preaching, homeless shelters, jails, prisons, just really any way to get the gospel out, one-on-one stuff at times, mainly open air preaching, but we're not opposed to any of the other ways either. So that's where we are now.
Yeah. Yeah. I find it very fascinating that a lot of guys that have that desire to go out and open air preach, they feel like there's a strong burden in their, burning in their bosom, right? Not in a Mormon type way, but they have that desire to want to go out and preach. There's not a lot of discipleship in that area, and unfortunately, a lot of guys end up going on YouTube and finding those Pelagian preachers, like you mentioned. This guy was not one of them, but they kind of get pulled into that. And then I think a lot of, and we can talk about this as we move forward, but I think a lot of times then biblical churches, that's what they see. And so then the open air preacher kind of becomes a stigma or something that you kind of like, I'm not sure if we want to endorse something like that, because what we see is those hellfire and brimstone preachers that need Jesus themselves.
Yeah.
Well, that's one reason too. As far as video goes and media and things like that, I think they're very helpful. There's a danger in that, obviously, if you're, and it's a fine balance as far as like self-promotion. And at the same time, when you have a ministry like what we're doing, a lot of we raise our own support. So a lot of that comes from people seeing what we're doing. But at the same time, I think, good quality videos of good, theologically sound preachers, if they're theologically sound and they're preaching in the open air, I think it really does help if we can somehow like flood the market, and always checking our spirit and our heart to make sure we have the right motive. But if we can flood what's out there and almost like drown out the Pelagians, the shock and awe guys, I think the more, but the better. Yeah. But it's a fine line, and it's definitely a hard balance.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's definitely something I've struggled with. A lot of times people put up pictures or Ricky will post videos when we go out, and I got into the habit of like check and see what kind of comments I'm getting, or check and see how many likes it is, and it was something noble to have out there, right? But my heart was off, and instead of thinking about how excited I was to get to worship God with preaching, I'm thinking I'm taking notes and making mental notes of all the times I get a pat on the back. And so it's definitely a really big danger, especially when you're new to it.
Yeah. And one thing that it kind of, it's funny because one thing with open air preaching, you get so much criticism also, even from Christians. I mean, it's interesting. I find it interesting how the Lord works. So on the one hand, we always have the constant temptation to be lifted up and exalt ourselves or others exalting us, but on the other hand, you have the Lord very graciously always bringing these thorns in the side, where we're, it depends on your context maybe, but all the just the criticism from the unbelievers, from a lot of people within the church. And then it's constant. And so, but yeah, like you said, I know that's something I think for all of us it's got to be something that we constantly are checking to see if our spirit's right. And it also helps to have, I think that's the other thing about open air preaching, and it's not, this is ideal. It's not always that way, but if you have a team, if you have a group of people that you're doing this with, I think it definitely helps because you can hold each other accountable. Mm-hmm. You can kind of, just kind of have each other's back, not only as far as like physical, but spiritually. And I know I've had that. Oh man, I can't, count the very helpful rebukes and encouragement and things like that I've received from guys I preach with, and it's so helpful. So that helps.
Yeah, definitely.
I know some of my early experiences with open air preachers in particular, I was at Iowa State, and it was those, hellfire, brimstone type people, big banners, always, telling people they're going to hell, at this time I'm not saved. I've come from a liberal Presbyterian church, so there's that aspects. But how radically different open air preaching was when I met George, because this is kind of the thing I'm thinking about. By the time I met George in England, probably about 3 or 4 years later, I've already kind of caught Ray Comfort's stuff, seen kind of how he's done it, and just the stark difference between the two, and the passion and the love that came that wasn't with the other ones. Like someone who seemed generally concerned about you and not just trying to like do it because they think that's the right thing to do, but actually has the passion to preach the gospel and see people saved. I think, and that's changed everything about how I thought open air preaching was, and kind of the defining moment to say, this isn't a bad thing outside of the biblical support we see in the Bible for doing that, whether it's countercultural or not.
Yeah. Yeah. And too, with, that's the other thing as far as the motive goes. And I know in my experience, and it's not a lot, maybe 5 years, in that brief amount of time within myself, I've seen a huge, I don't know, it's almost like when you first start doing it, you're just excited to kind of go out and do it, and you're pumped up, and you're excited that you kind of got over the cliff and the Lord gave you the courage to do it and things like that. But within all of that, I think it's easy to kind of lose the importance of people's souls and as far as how we're interacting with people. And by no means am I at a place where I can say I'm doing it perfectly, because I still want to grow a lot. But I have seen a shift from, I don't know, it's strange, it's weird, but it is almost like the reason why we do it has become, and the main purpose of open air preaching is to glorify God and to exalt Christ and to lift up Christ and to preach the gospel. But I think with that too, then that's another danger, because I think we can downplay the value of souls and conversions. And I just wrote another book called Even If None, and it's coming out in the fall. And First Love Ministries is First Love Missions. They're going to publish it. But and the whole premise of the book is that we should not evangelize for the sake of the one. We should evangelize for the glory of God. But at the same time, the one is still important.
Right.
And I think with open air preaching, we can lose the value of the one soul, especially as Reformed guys, and it should be exalting. And we are still successful even if nobody's converted. That's the point. But at the same time, it is important that the people we're preaching to realize that we do care about their souls. And we can do that in a way that's not compromising either, though.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And that's one of the things that I think with time and with a group of guys, like you said, around you or other brothers, or more importantly, being in a local church where you have accountability, you can mature over time, in your walk and in your street evangelism, whether it's open air preaching or, going out to witness at college campuses. You're going to grow and you're going to mature. Hopefully, as a believer, you're going to mature in maybe some of the things you would have done in the beginning that you're doing differently now, because, in the desire to glorify God through the open air preaching, through the evangelism, you've also become very compassionate and gracious towards those people you're trying to reach, and so I think that's why, like you said, I think that accountability is important to keep you in check, accountability with elders. And I want to get into that as well as we begin to talk about, open air preaching and with the church. One of the things that you wrote this book, A Certain Sound, It's a primer on open air preaching. Why did you primer? Thank you, Mike. Why did you have this desire to write this book here?
Well, mainly because there's not a lot of information out there. There's not a lot of material. And again, thinking back to my own days, when you first feel like the Lord's calling you to preach in the open air, where do you go? The reality is not a lot of pastors are gonna, this isn't a knock on pastors, but they're not really gonna know what to do with somebody who feels called to open air preach, usually. And so that's the main thing. If there's now again, the media helps, to be able to pull up open air preaching and say, okay, well, here's a ministry. They look like they're sound. I like what they're doing. I like how they go about it, and you can reach out to them. But as far as just good quality literature, I don't think. I mean, there's hardly anything that's been done on open air preaching You can find some really old stuff, which is really good, by the way. I would recommend that even over our book, just the 1800s stuff. But at the same time, partly another reason for writing the book is the fact that the people in the 1800s, they're dealing with things that are different than what we deal with as open air preachers today. And so different issues, and especially regarding the local church. I don't know how you can kind of see that even in, of course, like Whitfield's day and even after that, there always has been some tension between open air preaching and more of the established church, and so that's definitely a hurdle that we still, of course, encounter today. But there's just hardly anything out there, as far as I'm aware, and I've, especially having done this book now and really trying to find other material out there, it's really hard to find. And so that was the main thing. And then and I don't know, Scott did a lot of the practical side of the book, which is hugely helpful, especially because of his experience that he's had. And so, we kind of just tag teamed the chapters, and he definitely has strengths that really help the book. And then I don't know. I mean, we're blessed to be able to have certain people kind of come on board and see the value of having good literature out there on it, like Joel Beakey and some other guys. And so that helps, of course, is because I've met people saying, well, I don't know who you guys are, but when we saw that Joel Beakey did the forward, then we picked it up. And these are pastors. And so that's a good thing. I mean, the more, especially pastors, the more they're exposed to sound open air preaching, the more it's normalized. And the more it's normalized, I think the healthier it's going to be for everybody, for the church in general. If we can, if the pastors are working with the open air preachers and vice versa.
Yeah, that's one of the things when I was ordering this book, I think I got it from Reformation Heritage Books.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So I think where I picked it up at, and I thought it was really great to see it on there because this is a place where a lot of good Reformed guys go to get some good solid books. And then, as you said, having a forward by Joel Beakey. Looking on the back, you've got people writing up from, you got Sam Waldron on here, who's well known in the 1689 circles, the Reformed Baptist circles. And I think that does add to it because, as you said, one of those things, those challenges that open air preachers face is wanting to be biblical and within a local church, but then sometimes you don't find that support within the local church. Some of it I do believe is because they see those Pelagians and they just have this bad view of it, and they don't want that to come in and disrupt or destroy, what they have within their body. I remember the first time I ever open air preach was at the Kentucky Derby, and Bobby McCreary was my team leader. And I remember him telling me a story about how when he first went to the church that he was at the time, his pastor was like, I don't want an open air preacher here. I don't want no street preacher in the church, until he got to know Bobby, a sweet, loving guy, a gracious brother. Just because of that stigma, I think that's out there. But having some names like that that are known in the Reformed circles, saying, hey, look, here, we want to get this right. We want to understand it, and we can work together. and when we desire to, especially many of the open air preachers that I know, they desire to have that support from their local church. They don't want to be disconnected. They don't want to be the nomad, that's out there just doing it on their own, because they feel called, but then, are just, kind of away from the church because they can't get any support. And so I think it's good to see that,
Yeah, no. That's been one thing I've seen over and over. Just even my friend who doesn't do open air preaching, but does a lot of evangelism at the community college in Lynchburg, Virginia. He makes a couple trips out to Virginia Tech and VCU and UVA, University of Virginia, and just finding a church to just support him in that aspect has always been a problem. Some of it is because of how they view evangelism, but they tend to do, especially Liberty being a big proponent of servant evangelism, friendship evangelism, and, teaching all of that in the class. And even my evangelism teacher kind of pushing against open air preaching to a certain extent with it. I think so you have influences even in that way where he's teaching future pastors and, really pushing the idea that open air preaching doesn't work. It's not going to bring people into the church, pushing it. But I think that's why Ryan, clearly showed it's not just about bringing people to church. It's being faithful and giving God the glory. We're out there for the one, but successful evangelism is a successful presentation of the gospel that people can hear. And I think that's one aspect too, where pastors are pushing back because it just doesn't bring the results.
I think another thing that was in the book too, that really could help with some of the aversion that you guys commented on was how the preacher needed to be an exemplary churchman. So I mean, if all you're doing is going out evangelizing and coming to Sunday service maybe, but you're not involved in the church, you're not really connected, that might perpetuate the stereotype. But if you're really giving to your local church, if you're serving there as well, if you're connected and caring about people, they're going to get a different impression about the open air preacher himself, in addition to all the benefits that accrue by being a churchman and being responsible in that regard, to the preacher himself, being held accountable, being subject to church discipline and all the duties. But it's also going to, I think, cast open air preaching in a better light when they see that not only is he out there preaching, but he's also a good Christian. Yeah.
And another thing too, that I think a way that the church could really be helped by open air preaching is just training ministers. I know Mike mentioned seminary, but when you get solid, let's say a sound Reformed church, Presbyterian, Reformed Baptist, whatever, and you have sound theology. The thing about open air preaching is especially Reformed theology should be a huge proponent of open air preaching. The reason why you have places, let's say, that are promoting more of the lifestyle evangelism or friendship evangelism, things like that, it's a theological issue, because they think that in order to get a person saved, they're dealing with people whose minds have not been radically affected by the fall. They're dealing with people who have a libertarian free will. And so it's a matter of almost presenting the gospel in such a way that if we keep them from being too offended, if we keep them from whatever it is, then they'll make that decision. Whereas Reformed theology teaches that God is sovereign in salvation, and the means that he uses to save people is the gospel, and it's the proclamation of the gospel. And so in that sense, I mean, we have, again, I mean, it was mentioned of course you have the backing of Scripture, but you also, I mean, the whole purpose of Reformed theology, in a sense, is to glorify God, and that's exactly what preaching does. And that's the other thing about Reformed theology. There's a high view of preaching, and so one thing as far as the local church goes, every local church, I would hope, you're going to have people within the local church that you want to test as far as ministerial or whether they can preach, and you want to say, okay, how can we give this person opportunities to test his gifts? Well, open air preaching's now, of course, there's a lot that goes with it. It is, in a sense, maybe not for everybody, but at the same time, I mean, here's and I don't want to make a blanket statement for everybody, but to me, it is kind of strange, I guess, that so when you have people that say, okay, I've been called by God to preach, but they relegate their preaching only to the pulpit, then I think, okay, I mean, I'm not saying they're not called to preach, but there is a part of me that wonders why we wouldn't just preach anywhere, anytime there's an opportunity. And again, with a pastor, of course, he does have other responsibilities, and his responsibility, of course, is to the flock. But it is to say that if somebody is being called to preach, it does seem like they will have at least an interest in perhaps going and preaching on the streets, and that is a excellent way to train ministers. Same thing with seminaries, man. If you had seminaries with an open air preaching course in there, oh man, for even going out and evangelize, that helps. But to actually learn how to preach, and you can preach expositorily in the open air. It's especially if you're in a situation that's kind of apathetic and you're not going to get a lot of resistance or questions and things like that. You can usually pretty easily preach through an hour sermon or so. And so there's a lot of benefits that the church, at the local church, humbly kind of looks into this and say, okay, how can we use this in our ministry? And at the same time, it's like y'all said, I mean, as far as the open air preacher, it goes both ways, and the open air preacher being gracious and not wanting to jump ship just because somebody's a little nervous about open air preaching. So it goes both ways, but man, the fruit that could be had for the church and for God's people is really immense if we would just look at it and try to approach it in that way.
Yeah, I think another thing too, as you was mentioning that came to mind is because I know a few pastors that probably shouldn't be in that position, probably shouldn't be pastoring. They love the Lord, but they just don't seem to have that gift of teaching. And a lot of that should come through the local church. But unfortunately, a lot of people can just go to a seminary or go to especially in fundamental circles, you could just go to a Baptist Bible college. And then, but if there was those courses, you could really see, and if people were honest with their students, and saying, hey, brother, I know you love the Lord. I know you feel like you want to serve God this way, but you may be better suited serving the Lord in another capacity, Yeah,
I mean, and they have, Mike could tell you too, they do have preaching courses in seminary. Most seminary degree will have at least one, usually 2 or 3 preaching courses. So the question would be, what's the difference between open air preaching and, let's say, just your regular preaching course? And that kind of goes along with, and there are a few places in our book. It's been a while since I've looked at it that talk about it, but if you think about, when you're open air preaching, one of the things that you have to be equipped in, and this is what's so great about y'all's podcast, is apologetics. Mm-hmm. And being able to really not just know like the textbook answers for each cult or each religion or things like that, but to actually hear it from the lost person's perspective, because you're out there and you're seeing it. And so, and another thing, so you can get that from evangelism in general, but one thing about open air preaching is it causes you, one, to mortify your flesh. I mean, it's hard to go out and just start preaching. It is so, I mean, to this day, it's difficult. But you see that the Lord comes through when you go and you do that. and seeing that, man, it buoys you up. It buoys your faith. It gives you this supernatural, just faith. You know, of course, it's always supernatural, but it's like this power, this strange power that we have, that we're able to rely on God in these kinds of circumstances. So that's one advantage, you know, and then the other advantage is just learning how to adapt to the situations that you're encountering. And because it's fluid, open air preaching is very fluid. You're going to see different things. You can't, again, I mentioned sometimes you can preach through a text. Usually you can't, but at the same time, it's a good way to train as far as just, you know, getting everything to Christ, staying in the text. I don't know. There's a lot more as far as the benefits of open air preaching, but it is different from pulpit preaching. I think that needs to be clarified. It is different. And that's why not everyone's gift or called to it necessarily, but everyone can be benefited by it if you are called to preach.
Yeah, I know at Southern there's 2 preaching classes, and then there's actually a third one called evangelistic preaching. It's taught every so often. I don't know the rotation on that one, where they kind of go over the guys out from Eastern Kentucky. I'm in Western Kentucky, Eastern Kentucky. And so I think, I don't know much. I'm assuming it's more tent revival type, or maybe even like a Spurgeon type evangelistic pointed message, you know, outside of what would normally be done on a Sunday morning, though the gospel would be preached, you know, kind of in a different expository way with that. And I also know, at least at one time, I don't know if Master still does it, but Masters, you know, on the Master Seminary used to require their students, I think in the evangelism class, to do some open air preaching there. It's been a while since I've talked to a student at Masters, and yeah, he talked about going to a street corner and just opening it up and preaching and for part of this class. And so, you know, there are some, you know, seminaries, so there's 2 there that you can kind of get into these styles of preaching and just develop that and learn it. I don't know how much evangelical preaching at Southern would be. I never took the class, so I, you know, obviously can't say, but I think just seeing it, I've never open air preached myself. I'd rather just do the one-to-one conversations on the street in my own, but, you know, noticing the difference, just even going to the Derby to do videotaping, or just to be supportive in a way to, you know, do that. And just seeing, I mean, Derby's rough. I've never seen anything.
That's what I hear. I hear that's the worst one.
Especially when they come out after the horse race, after the actual running of the roses.
They've all just lost their money.
Yeah. And they're already drunk going in.
Right,
and they're just now mad drunk coming out.
Yeah, Puritan Reformed Theological Seminary. So Scott Smith actually, I don't know exactly the backstory behind it, but he actually went in one time, and Dr. Beakey and other professors, they invited Scott to come in and actually do a training. And so he did that, and on open air preaching, and then they all went out and had some of the students go out with them. And so there are, and that's the thing. I think because you see a lot of guys open air preaching now, and that's something that surprises me in a sense, because when you talk to guys who have been doing it for a long time, or who haven't been doing it, but they've been around a while, they'll tell you, man, like 30 years ago, there's hardly anybody open air preaching. But nowadays it is pretty common, I think. And there is an interest in it and a hunger for it. And so to do it correctly is the key. And by that, I mean theologically, because every guy's, your personality is different. Your approach is going to be different. But man, it's what an amazing thing that God he really is doing something, I think, in the West, as far as just raising up guys who have a burden to go out to a street corner and just preach God's word. I mean, it's amazing kind of thing. What's going to come from all this?
I think as you guys was talking there, it came to my mind, there'd be a lot more, I think, family integrated churches if pastors had preached on the streets and had the, the interaction or people talking, because they wouldn't be distracted by, a crying baby.
Right.
But with go ahead.
For that to work, you need to have the congregation to practice. Go listen to their pastor on the street.
Yeah, right. That's a good point. Right.
Now, with open air preaching, I know you go to college campuses. We have our college evangelism tour coming up next month, and it's a great place to do ministry. Why evangelize at college campuses? Why evangelize in consistent places?
That's so. So two questions there, right? So first, why college campuses? I think the main thing is because, number one, we're allowed to do it, and number two, that is a place where students are very prone to actually engage and to interact and to not only take literature, but to kind of linger and to kind of stop and give you a hearing. In my experience, it's very hard to find that like in a downtown area. People are walking by, they're doing their own thing. But when you go to a college campus, I think it's very more interactive. I enjoy that. Again, that's kind of like a personality thing. Some guys like to just go and preach, and other guys want to engage a little more and talk to people. And so a college campus is great for that. And of course, you have thousands of students usually that are just walking by, and you cannot do your one-on-one to 20,000 students. Now, one-on-one is awesome. It's very good. It's very helpful, especially again if you have a team and you have different people there, and they're everybody's about the Lord's business in some way. That's a great thing. But a college campus, and of course, particularly there, you do have not only the more of the physical sins, the sexual debauchery and the alcohol and things like that. But of course, now you're talking about these really godless ideologies that they're teaching. Mm-hmm. And so it's dark for that sense, it's a huge mission field, and y'all know how it is, man. So when you go to England, so when you go to England, and one thing that really kind of takes you by surprise, for me anyways, is just how rampant atheism is and evolution. And it's just like, I think it's like 95%, 90% of people say they're atheists in the UK. And so you see that and you're like, man, how can this be? But that's exactly, to me, in my experience, again, to me, that's how a college campus is. And so when you go to the college campus, it reminds me a lot of what you see in England right now. And so there's just this heightened level of depravity on college campuses. And of course, also, one of the benefits is that these students are at a very formidable period of time. This is the age where they are kind of, if they did grow up in a Christian home, if they weren't saved, of course, now they're out of it. But at the same time, you're also getting people, they're at a period of life where they are impressionable. And the Lord does have an impact there, it seems like. And then secondly, as far as ministering in one location, I found this to be true for the last 3 years. And I had never done it this way so much. But when we moved to El Paso, and then I have a family here, and so I'm not able to travel very much. And, you start almost by default, by necessity, you start going to the same place because that's where you live. And over the last 3 years, I've seen so much fruit from just going to that same spot or a few same spots consistently on a regular basis, because the students, let's say on a college campus, if you're there consistently, they begin to recognize you. You begin to not only make relationships, but also they come to you. They'll look for you. If they have spiritual questions, they'll come look for you. And that's kind of something that I think we underestimate. And then of course you can actually, for those who are interested or who the Lord does convert, then you're right there. You're able to disciple them. You're probably going to be familiar with some of the local churches in the area. You're probably going to be familiar as far as like, okay, it might be good if you go here, or, I can give you right here. And that's something that you see when you're at the same spot over and over again. There's a lot of fruit from that. And it's not to downplay necessarily guys who are able, like Whitfield, for instance, he's able to travel a little more, or he did. I don't know if he's if he's able to, or if he should have, but the Lord used him in a mighty way. And so he's doing that, and people are being saved. And but I think both ways are good. But yeah, if you're in a spot and you're hitting it over and over and over again, with that comes challenges. Like there's an element of resistance because people don't want to see you there over and over and over and over again necessarily, the unbelievers. So they'll come after you harder because they know, well, this guy's not going to go away tomorrow. He's going to be here. He's in for the long haul. But at the same time, I think you definitely see a lot of things that you will not see if you're not in a consistent area.
I think one thing too, going to a smaller college, like a community college, is you can see the same person over and over again and kind of check in and say, hey, have you been thinking about our last conversation? And, try to continue that dialogue if they haven't shut you out. Now, sometimes they, you watch them avoid you, at times, but, I think so there's a benefit there, just the continual presence and being able to continually be in certain people's lives. Now, at a bigger campus, that might not always be the case, depending how a person walk or whatever. But I think there's a bit of, for smaller locations, there's a benefit there.
Well, at even bigger campuses too, you kind of, for each semester, you're going to have the same class if you're going to school there. So you're going to have the same class in the same area and same day. And so usually even on a bigger campus, you'll see the same people over and over and over again, at least for that semester, because they got to go that way. And so, yeah, that's a great point too, Mike. Yep.
Yeah, I remember 3 years ago, we were with our college evangelism tour. We were at the University of Akron, where Nathaniel was just at the other day, and we'll be there for 2 days on our college evangelism tour. I remember a conversation I had with a young lady, and I seen her later that year at the Cleveland Pride Parade. She was walking in the parade, and it was our first time going. And so we were just trying to fill it out, and we didn't do any open air preaching because there was only one of us that was preaching. And so I was like, okay, we'll just hand out tracts. The other guys didn't feel comfortable doing that. We'll just hand them out. And I was on the other side trying to catch all these people as they were going into this park to celebrate, their sin. And I was handing out tracts, and she come down. She's like, "That's the guy that was at our college, at our university." And so, It is interesting how you do run into people, and then oftentimes even we've seen people that we run into at the abortion center when we're out there preaching downtown Cleveland as well. And so you run into people when the more that you get out, the more you tend to see some of these people that you've evangelized. That's another thing I wanted to talk about too. Is this is my thought. Maybe tell me what you think about this and ways that we can guard ourselves from becoming hardened in some of these areas where we go to. Because like I was saying to Nathaniel once before, we were talking about abortion ministry, that it's good to be grounded in more than one place where you go, because if you're only doing evangelism at the abortion center, it can become very easy to be hard-hearted because you're constantly right there. Not that you're not seeing people out there that could possibly die that day, but you're confronting it right there and then. And there's this danger where you can become hard-hearted towards individuals like that and then become maybe angry in your preaching. So what do you think about that as far as a balance in being consistent in some areas, but then having some balance in the areas that you do go so that you don't become only at one place?
Yeah. And I mean, so one of the things that would help also, again, is just other people holding you accountable. Because I mean, that's the thing. I think when you have that, then you're able to have a guy say, "Hey man, your spirit seems a little off. You seem hard and you seem bitter." So that helps. But yeah, definitely. I mean, again, I think it goes back to a call. I mean, I think all of us, we have our preferred spot, as far as where we preach, where we evangelize. We have the spot that we feel most comfortable in. But as just ambassadors of Christ, I think at the same time, we're still called to go outside of that and do different things and minister in different places. But, as far as just a hardened spirit, I mean, yeah, the abortion clinic's tough. The abortion clinic is a hard place. the college campus is also hard for another reason. It's also very difficult. But I mean, brother, honestly, I mean, that's something where it's almost like every single day. I know for me, I have to fight against that. I have to really, I think the most helpful thing that we can do is to have a sincere walk with the Lord, where we're spending time with the Lord, we're spending time in the Word. And I think it's the Word that kind of tenderizes us and softens us, it keeps us in a place where we do have the right spirit. And of course, being around the saints and other brothers and I think all of that helps and it goes into play. But to me, I mean, there's nothing more advantageous, I would say, than just like a real prayer life, like where you're really spending time with God. Not even, a corporate prayer is good too, but as an individual to have where you're on your knees, man, where you're with the Lord. There's nothing else to me that tenderizes us like that. And if you're not, I mean, the thing is too, if you're not doing that, that's a sure sign. I mean, that's the way to check. If you do recognize yourself becoming hardened and bitter, it's gotta be your prayer life. It has to be. And so that's, I think, going back to the one-on-one stuff, getting back to basics and just seeking the Lord. I know, guys, just real quick. So a guy like Don Carnes and Don Carnes is funny. He's not on social media, but man, that guy preaches probably like 500 times a year. And he's 60, I think it's like 66, 67. But, one thing that he does is he intentionally takes 2 or 3 weeks off at a time and where he just regroups, and he reads good stuff and just spends time with the Lord and prays and just kind of just shuts down all this stuff and just, to recalibrate kind of. And I think we have to do that on a daily basis too.
Yeah.
So I guess one question, and I've studied this a little bit, so I think we see examples in the New Testament of open air preaching. You have the prophets out there proclaiming to the people and knowing they're not going to listen, like Isaiah or some. What do you think led to kind of the downfall from the early church to kind of maybe the Renaissance with Knox and others in the Reformation and Whitefield, and then pretty much another downfall with it? I don't know if you've studied that or not.
Mm-hmm. So as far as the like the contemporary era,
yeah, if you have something on.
So open air preaching in general, right there again. I mean, open air preaching, the history of open air preaching seems to be the case of it's done by necessity. And so usually what happens is, for instance, like with the Reformation, the churches were owned by the Roman Catholics. They dominated. They're not going to let you get up and preach a Protestant doctrine from a Roman Catholic pulpit. And if you did try to do that, they'd come after you. So Knox's bodyguard was one of the guys that would do that. So and then you have even the Lollards, you have Wycliffe and then the guys that followed him. And then what's going on there? And even in the early church, of course, they didn't even have pulpits. So open air preaching does seem to be the case where, and even Whitefield, I mean, the pulpits were shut down. The pulpits were outlawed from him. He couldn't use them. Same thing with Wesley. And so by default, by necessity, they would go outside and they would preach. And so same thing, I think, even with the Puritans. I mean, there was a time, of course, with the Puritans when they were ejected from their pulpits, they also were meeting in fields and preaching and just wherever they found people. And that's the goal of open air preaching. You go to where the lost is, and it's a matter of saying, how do we get the gospel to these people? Especially in our day, I think we are living in a great time for open air preaching. Back in the 70s, back in the 80s, I was born in 85, so I wasn't. But it does seem to be the case that in those days, people, the lost, would still come to church. You could invite the lost to church; they would come to church. Nowadays, the lost are not coming to church. You can invite them, you can knock on their doors. I mean, for the most part, they're not going to come in. You go to a college campus, and we've tried it, where you're inviting people to your church, you're doing everything you can. They're not coming. And so really it's like, okay, so what are we left with? Well, we got to go to them, as the Great Commission tells us to do. Go to them, get the gospel to them, whether it's one-on-one, whether it's a gospel track, whether it's open air preaching. And that's the main focus. And so, that's what you see consistently throughout church history. The people are not coming to us. We got to go to them. Or, of course, the churches are not open to us. So we're going to go outside and do it that way.
Yeah. I have a quote here from Eusebius of Caesarea talking about the 2nd century, and related to kind of Ignatius. And he goes, "For indeed, most of the disciples of that time of Ignatius, animated by the divine word, with more ardent love for philosophy," and that's more of a asceticism there, which I would not promote, "had already fulfilled the command of our Savior, and they distributed goods to the many. Then starting out upon long journeys, they performed the office of evangelists, being filled with the desire to preach Christ to those who had not yet heard the word of faith, and to deliver them the divine gospels." I think, you see this multiple times in the early church of how the gospel has gone out to the heathens, and maybe more so because it was more accepted to do open air preaching. Mars Hill is obviously, that's what they do. I mean, Speaker Corner in England, they're in Hyde Park. That's what you do. That's what it's there for. But at least my reading of the early church when dealing with this was just this push. This is what they did. They went out, and part of their apologetics and defending against the heresies and other religions was the fact that they would go out. The Greeks taught the Greek, but we go out with to everyone. It doesn't matter who you are with it. And then what you see, and then in the record, is when Constantine becomes emperor, legalizes Christianity, you lose evangelism altogether. The rise of asceticism comes in because now you need people who are more devoted, because people are coming Christian for political reasons and not because they're being saved. With that, I think there's, part of that downfall there. You just get, the church becomes loose in kind of its theological, and then if it's importance, because it just doesn't see it anymore.
Yeah, and that's a good point, because there's definitely it's almost like a blank slate or a dark area. So you can trace the history of open air preaching. Even the early church, like you mentioned, Irenaeus was an open air preacher. There's other guys too. I can't think of them off the top of my head. They're in the book though. So they were open air preaching, but yeah, between the years, I don't know, man, like 500 and probably earlier than that, like 400, all the way up until there's a guy named Arnold of Brescia, and like the early Middle Ages. You don't see anything really. You do see the Roman Catholics going into certain areas, and it's more like missionary endeavors. And of course, by default, again, you're going to vocalize things in the open air. But as far as good biblical doctrine goes, no, man, that's the history, right? There's a dark period, and then there's the light, and they go out with the gospel, and they're persecuted, savage. I mean, that's the thing about us. We go out and I was arrested back in 2 or 3 years ago, but that's nothing. I mean, I was in there for 8 hours. I got out, and I'm inside, and they're not whipping me with lashes or anything like that. So, I mean, we still have it very light. And I think the challenge though is, and maybe an exhortation is, like as far as open air preaching goes, I know it is hard to crucify and mortify the flesh, but if we look at that as far as what we put up with in America or even in the UK, in light of what you see other people put up with throughout church history, man, this is nothing. All we get are a few rebukes every now and then, or people yelling mean things to us, or maybe you might get a slap on the wrist or something really easy. And of course that's hard, because our flesh still doesn't like it. But at the same time, and I mean, the whole purpose is as far as Christ is concerned, I mean, he's worthy to suffer so much more than just a slap on the wrist for, So again, I mean, open air preaching is difficult, but by God's grace, he does give us the power to do it. We can do it.
You have a video of George getting slapped in the face in Cambridge.
True story, huh? Wow.
Yeah. I wasn't there for it. I think it was either just before I started going out or after I left England and I moved back to the States. But yeah, there's a 4-video set someone recorded. I think it's Marcus, the atheist from Cambridge University, who was always heckling. Or at least maybe he was just in the video. But yeah, there's this lady. George was engaging her, and she just walked up and slapped him across the face.
Yeah.
And just kept on preaching. Kind of because I know George and I talked about it. If he's preaching, he just takes it.
Yeah.
You know, if his other times he'll defend himself. But that was kind of
probably should have slapped a lady back, right?
Yeah, that's probably you being America, England, tensions.
Right.
You know, that might not be the best. But yeah, I'll see if I can dig it up again. It was on YouTube.
Hey, that's another reason why you got to make sure, man, we're walking in the Spirit, because you never know what's going to happen.
Yeah. All right, well, we've come down to the end of the program here. So, Ryan, I just wanted to close it out by having you maybe share some good testimonies of your time, at the college campus, maybe a good story of an encounter that you had with someone, and then maybe some last encouraging words to those who may be called to open air preach, and just some encouraging words to them.
So my favorite story is about 3 years ago. I was preaching at UTEP. 2 years ago, maybe. No, it wasn't even that. It was maybe 16 months ago. And so I'm preaching at UTEP, and I'd been there by then for like 2 years, and preaching there every day, and things had kind of gotten apathetic. And, at the same time, I was reading a great book, by the way, for open air preachers. If you want to be encouraged, read The Calvinistic Methodist Fathers of Wales. Unbelievable. It was one of Martin Lloyd-Jones's favorite books. Anyway, so I've been reading that. And so I don't know, I was stirred up, man. I really did feel really close to the Lord during that season. But as far as the preaching goes, not a lot was going on. Not a lot was happening. So anyways, it's the last week of campus, last week of the semester. I go out there, hardly anybody's on campus. It was finals week. And finals week is usually really slow. I usually don't even preach on finals week. But I went out there anyways. Sure enough, it's kind of slow. And I thought, man, I don't even know if it's worth preaching, And so, but I thought, I'll preach. And then when I'm done, I'll just go home. And so I start preaching, and then there's a student who he comes up, and he sits about 25, 30 feet away from me, and he just sits there, and he's just listening. It's really kind of just like me and him, because nobody else is out there. So I'm preaching and he's listening. And I'm thinking, okay, because you can kind of tell sometimes when they're about to leave, they'll start to stir. And so I'm kind of watching for that, because I want if he starts to stir, I was going to break it off and to go talk to him. But I keep preaching, and he doesn't stir. He's just listening. And I think I preached for like 45. I preached for a long time, and I was preaching on the holiness, or how to live a holy life, like the holiness of God. And so when I get done, he comes up to me, and he says. He asked me something like, well, how do I live for the glory of God? That's what I was preaching on. How do I live for the glory of God? This guy asked. So I was like, wow, man, that's a great question. And so we talk, and I'm kind of elaborating on some more of what I was preaching about. And he seems interested and hungry, but at the same time, you guys know how it is, man. You see that a lot, but then nothing comes from it. So, that's kind of in the back of my mind. At the same time, I want to assume the best, and so I keep sharing the gospel with him and things like that. So I'm leaving campus that day after we get done talking. I gave him my email address. I'm leaving campus that day, and I see this guy talking to the Mormons. And I'm at a place where, like, I'm driving out of the college, and so I'm just about to get into traffic, and people are kind of getting behind me. And so, but at the same time, like, he's to the right of me. I roll down the passenger side window, and I'm thinking, man, he's talking to the Mormons. I got like 30 seconds at most to say something. And so the only thing I could think of, and I wouldn't recommend this approach usually, but I said, his name's Jose. I said, Jose, watch out. I said, these guys are a cult. And of course the Mormons turn around and they're like, why would you call us that? And I asked the guy, I said, do you think that you'll be a God one day? And he says, well, yes, I hope so. And I said, Jose, man, that goes against everything we just talked about. And that's all I had. By then people were honking and things like that. So I left. And I'm thinking, man, he's gone, 28,000 students. I don't have his contact information. He has mine. But sure enough, he reached out to me and he said, the Mormons are coming over in the morning. I'm trying to figure out what you meant by that they're a cult. And so I sent him everything I had on Mormons. Again, trying to be hopeful, but also knowing usually what happens. But anyway, sure enough, so I gave him my telephone number afterwards, and he texted me afterwards, and he said, the Mormons just left. I don't believe what they said. And he said something like, what do I do now? And so, and man, this is like a year and a half ago. From that day on, he was at the very next Bible study at our church. This guy's like a faithful church goer now. And he's 22, very, no, not even that, maybe 20, 21, very mature kid. The Lord's using him in many ways. In fact, he's been with me at last week. He was with me at New Mexico State. Yesterday he was with me at UTEP. And so you see the cycle there. And the Lord saved him through open air preaching. And what encourages me, and then I'll leave it with this. What encouraged me though, is he said, I had heard you preaching like 3 or 4 times before this time, but I had never had the courage to really come up and say anything. And so that encourages me, and it should encourage us, that when we preach, we don't know what the Lord is doing. We don't know how the Lord is working. They are listening. They're hearing this stuff. And so don't be discouraged. Don't quit. Just keep going, because we know that the Lord is his word does not return void. And it is true. It's a real thing. It really does not return void. And so whether it's to the conversion of anybody, whether it's to the hardening of souls, we don't know. That's up to the Lord. But at the same time, man, what a privilege to be able to go out there and actually see things happen every now and then. And there's a ton of more stories that we could tell, but that's definitely my favorite one.
Well, praise the Lord for that. That was very encouraging to hear. It's always encouraging, again, when, like as you said, when you see fruit, because a lot of times you don't see fruit, and then you can become very discouraged and like, is this making a difference? And so when you're able to see that, that's always a huge encouragement. All right, well, that's been G220 Radio for tonight. Ryan, we want to thank you. Excuse me. We want to thank you for coming on the program tonight and sharing with us some of your insight on open air preaching and what you've learned and your experiences in it. And so we thank you for that, brother. And we praying for you as you continue to go out there and minister in your area as well.
Yeah, thank you.
And George wants to say hi. He's on the board, so he's been, I'm assuming, watching it. So he did
George.
say to say hi.
Hi, George.
All right, so that's G220 Radio. Until next time, God bless.
God bless.